Boule de Suif. Boule de Suif. Translated variously as dumpling, butterball, ball of fat, or ball of lard, is a famous short story by the late 19th century French writer Guy de Maupassant. First published in April 1880, it is arguably his most famous short story and is the title story for his collection on the Franco-Prussian War. Titled Boule de Suif et Autres Contes de la Guerre. Dumpling and Other Stories of the War. Plot summary. The story is set in the Franco-Prussian War, and follows a group of French residents of Rouen, recently occupied by the Prussian army. The 10 travelers decide for various reasons to leave Rouen and flee to Le Havre in a stagecoach. Sharing the carriage are Boule de Suif or Butterball. Lit. Suet dumpling, also translated as ball of fat. A prostitute whose real name is Elizabeth Rousset. The strict Democrat Cornudette. A shop-owning couple from the petty bourgeoisie, M and Madame Loiseau, a wealthy upper bourgeoisie factory owner, and his wife, M and Madame Carré-Lamarden, the Comte and Comtesse of Breville, and 2 nuns. Thus, the carriage constitutes a microcosm of French society, representing different parts of the French population during the late 19th century. Due to the terrible weather, the coach moves very slowly and by midday has only covered a few miles. The occupants initially snubbed Boule de Suif, but their attitudes change when she produces a picnic basket full of lovely food and offers to share its contents with the hungry travelers. At the village of Totes, the carriage stops at the local coaching inn, and the occupants, hearing a German voice, realize they have blundered into Prussian-held territory. A Prussian officer detains the party at the inn indefinitely without telling them why. Over the next 2 days, the travelers become increasingly impatient, and are finally told by Boule de Suif that they are being detained until she agrees to sleep with the officer. She is repeatedly called before the officer, and always returns in a heightened state of agitation. Initially, the travelers support her and are furious at the officer's arrogance. But their indignation soon disappears as they grow angry at Boule de Suif for not sleeping with the officer so that they can leave. Over the course of the next 2 days, the travelers use various examples of logic and morality to convince her it is the right thing to do. She finally gives in and sleeps with the officer, who allows them to leave the next morning. As they continue on their way to Le Havre, these representatives of virtue ignore Boule de Suif and turn to polite topics of conversation, glancing scathingly at the young woman while refusing to even acknowledge her, and refusing to share their food with her the way that she did with them earlier. As the coach travels on into the night, Cornudette starts whistling the Marseillaise while Boule de Suif seethes with rage against the other passengers, and finally weeps for her lost dignity. End of the summary. Themes in the story. The main theme focuses on French resistance to the German occupiers during the war. During the first half of the story, the narrator explains the background of each of the occupants, with particular emphasis on the petty bourgeois Democrat, Cornudette, who is said to have devised all manner of defenses for Rouen. The overriding theme is that while the occupants talk a great deal about resisting the invaders, they are ultimately running away in a cowardly fashion rather than staying in the town. The first section of the story also establishes that the most fiercely patriotic passenger is Boule de Suif herself, an insignificant and unpopular character in Rouen, while the aristocrats and bourgeois are portrayed as happier to betray their country in order to end the war and return to their comfortable lives. In that respect, Maupassant praises the patriotic fervor of the inhabitants of the provinces, in sharp contrast to other French writers of the period who accused provincial French citizens of being apathetic and cowardly. Boule de Suif's personal resistance grows throughout the story, when the coach is stopped by the Germans at the village of Totes. The other passengers meekly follow the officer's orders while Boule de Suif refuses to cooperate as easily. Boule de Suif's resistance to the officer's sexual advances again shows her patriotism, something which is noticed by the other characters. who comment that although it is Boule de Suif's job to sleep with men, she patriotically refuses to allow herself to be conquered by the German officer. Like Maupassant's other short stories on the Franco-Prussian War, he tends to stereotype the German soldiers. The troops holding Rouen are hinted at as dull and slow-witted. The German officer at the inn is portrayed in the same way as Maupassant depicts German officers throughout his stories. The officer is shown as being arrogant, morally dubious, and unfeeling. The description of the officer in his room at the inn suggests that he is pointlessly destructive, uncultured, and boorish. At the same time, there are passages that describe how German troops get about their daily life and long to return home to their own families. The theme of class barrier is also tackled in the story. Throughout the story, Maupassant portrays the inhabitants of the coach in various disparaging ways. The aristocratic Comte and Comtesse are revealed to be weak and cowardly in spite of their position as the chief dignitaries of Rouen. The manufacturer and his wife are constantly portrayed as greedy and materialistic. And the manufacturer's wife in particular is always shown to be shocked whenever her husband spends any money. The petty bourgeois wine seller and his wife are shown as corrupt and morally reprehensible, the most likely of the party to betray their country simply to return to a life of greed in peace. The two nuns traveling in the coach are at first portrayed as quiet and subservient to God, and later show themselves as fiery, patriotic, and doing more for their country than the other occupants of the coach. The nuns claim to be traveling to a military hospital to treat wounded French soldiers, thus offering the deciding argument towards persuading Boule de Suif to abandon her resistance. The narrator offers to excuse their crafty argumentation as accidental stupidity. But the nuns' base behavior as they fail to share food with the courtesan raises a question mark, if not necessarily on their story then on their altruistic motivation. Cornudet is repeatedly shown as a man who is little more than a drunken, lecherous, and cowardly man who is not prepared to stand up for his vicious anti-German beliefs when the time comes. In contrast to all of these is Boule de Suif herself, revealed to be the most fiercely patriotic, kind-hearted, and morally admirable character, which Maupassant contrasts with the hypocrisy and snobbery of the other travelers. Despite being shunned by the other occupants at first, she gladly shares her picnic basket with the hungry occupants of the coach, but at the end of the novel, when she has no food for the other half of the journey, the coach's other occupants refuse to share their food with her, an ingratitude made even worse by the fact that it was Boule de Suif's personal sacrifice that allowed them to leave. Her self-sacrifice in sleeping with the German officer underlines her personal courage and the blind hypocrisy of the other travelers. The travelers go to great lengths to persuade Boule de Suif to sleep with the officer in order that he will let the coach continue its journey. And the travelers fill Boule de Suif's head with arguments, arguing that it is for the good of the country, that it is not morally wrong to sleep with the officer to let the travelers leave, and that the longer she waits, the more young French soldiers will die as the nuns are not there to look after them. When Boule de Suif gives in and sleeps with the officer, the rest of the travelers throw a party without her, and when the coach finally leaves the next morning, they treat her with utter disgust and contempt, although she has freed them and they had induced her to lose her dignity. End of the topic. Thank you.